The sun was beginning to set, casting a golden glow over the village fields. The soft hum of the evening breeze rustled through the trees, but Carolina felt none of its peace. She sat by the riverbank, her hands gripping the fabric of her dress, her chest rising and falling in silent sobs. Her parents had just told her the truth. Mr. Rodriguez, the wealthiest and most powerful man in their village, had given her family an ultimatum. Either they repaid their crushing debt in full, or she would have to marry him. He was old enough to be her father. A man with a reputation of cruelty, known for taking what he wanted without remorse. Carolina felt suffocated by the weight of it all. She had always been a dutiful daughter, but was she expected to give up her dreams, her happiness, her very life, just to settle a debt she hadn't created? A twig snapped behind her. She turned quickly, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. Carolina. James stood there, his breathing heavy, his dark brown eyes filled with concern. His shirt was stained with dirt, a sign that he had been working in the fields all day. Despite his exhaustion, his worry for her outweighed everything else. "I heard rumors," he said, stepping closer. "Tell me they're not true." Carolina looked away. She couldn't meet his gaze. "James, it's true." Her voice cracked as she forced out the words. "My parents say it's the only way. We have no choice." James clenched his fists. "No. There has to be another way." His voice was firm, but there was a tremor in it, one that betrayed his fear. Carolina finally looked at him, her eyes filled with sorrow. "What choice do I have? If we refuse, we lose everything. We'll be thrown into the streets." James knelt in front of her, taking her hands in his calloused ones. "I don't care if I have to work night and day. I'll find a way. But I won't let them take you away from me." A lump formed in Carolina's throat. James had always been there for her. Through every hardship, every struggle, every moment of doubt, he was the one constant in her life. But could love truly stand against power and money? She didn't have the answer. That night, James made a decision. He would go to her parents himself. He had to make them see that selling their daughter's happiness was not the answer. As Carolina watched him walk away, she felt the first spark of hope she had known in days. Maybe, just maybe, love would find a way. The night sky stretched endlessly over the village, its vast darkness punctuated by shimmering stars. A cool wind swept through the fields, rustling the crops and carrying with it the scent of damp earth. But James hardly noticed. His heart pounded in his chest as he strode toward Carolina's small weathered home. Inside, the dim glow of a single oil lamp flickered against the cracked walls. Carolina's parents, Mr. and Mrs. Fernandez, sat at the worn wooden table, their faces lined with worry. The air in the house was thick with silence, one heavy with resignation. James stepped forward, his fists clenched at his sides. "Mr. and Mrs. Fernandez, please. I need to speak with you." Carolina's mother, a frail woman with tired eyes, exchanged a weary glance with her husband before nodding. "Sit, James," her father said gruffly. But James remained standing. "I won't take much of your time. I came to ask, no, to beg you. Please don't force Carolina into this marriage." Mr. Fernandez let out a long sigh, rubbing his temples. "You think this is what we want?" he asked bitterly. "Do you think I would willingly give my daughter away to a man twice her age if we had a choice?" James' voice was firm. "There is always a choice." Mrs. Fernandez's lips trembled as she spoke. "You don't understand, James. We owe Mr. Rodriguez more money than we could ever repay. If we refuse him, he'll take everything, our home, our land. We will have nothing left." James swallowed the lump forming in his throat. He had known the situation was dire, but hearing it from Carolina's own parents made it all the more real. "Then let me help," he said. "I will work extra shifts. I'll take any job I can find. Give me time, and I'll find a way to pay the debt." Mr. Fernandez shook his head. "It's not just about the money. It's about power. Even if we manage to scrape together what we owe, do you think Mr. Rodriguez will let this go? He wants Carolina, James. And men like him, they don't take no for an answer." James felt his stomach churn. "So what? You're just going to hand her over to a man who sees her as nothing more than property?" Silence filled the small room. James' chest tightened as he looked at Carolina's mother, whose eyes were now brimming with tears. "Mrs. Fernandez, please. You're her mother. You know what this will do to her. Can you really stand by and let this happen?" The older woman's lips trembled, but she said nothing. James exhaled sharply. "At least give me some time. Just a few days. Let me try to find a way to repay the debt before you make a decision that will ruin her life forever." Mr. Fernandez sighed heavily, rubbing a hand over his face. "And if you fail?" James lifted his chin, his voice unwavering. "Then I will leave this village and never return. But at least I will know I did everything I could to save her." Another silence. This time, longer. Then, at last, Carolina's father nodded. "You have 3 days, James. But if you can't come up with the money, we have no choice." James' stomach knotted, but he forced himself to nod. 3 days. That was all the time he had to save the woman he loved. As he stepped out into the night, the weight of the impossible task ahead settled on his shoulders. But no matter what, he would fight. Because Carolina was worth it. The next morning, the village awakened to the usual sounds of roosters crowing and merchants setting up their stalls. But for James, the world felt different. Time was no longer a luxury. He had 3 days to change Carolina's fate. He wasted no time. By dawn, he was already in the fields, working twice as hard, his muscles aching under the scorching sun. He gathered crops, loaded wagons, and carried sacks of grain to the market, all for a few measly coins. But it wasn't enough. By noon, sweat dripped from his brow as he approached Mr. Alvarez, the town's blacksmith. "I need work," James pleaded. "Anything. I'll shovel coal, hammer iron, whatever you need." Mr. Alvarez, a burly man with a soot-covered face, studied him before nodding. "All right, boy. You work till sundown, and I'll pay you fairly." James barely had time to catch his breath before he was put to work. The forge burned hot, the air thick with smoke and the sound of metal striking metal. But James didn't complain. Every coin he earned meant a chance to free Carolina. As the sun dipped below the horizon, James counted his earnings for the day. Still not enough. His heart pounded as he looked toward the wealthier side of the village, where men gambled away fortunes in the town square. A reckless thought entered his mind. What if he gambled? He had always been cautious, but desperate times called for desperate measures. One good hand, one lucky roll of the dice, and he could double, maybe even triple his money. His hands trembled as he stepped toward the gathering of men. Among them was Miguel, a notorious gambler known for winning, and for ruining men who played against him. "What's this?" Miguel smirked as James sat at the table. A farm boy looking to play with the big men. James ignored the taunt. He placed half his earnings on the table. 1 game. The dice rolled. James' heart pounded as they tumbled across the wooden surface. The moment they landed, the crowd erupted in cheers. James had won. Relief surged through him as he gathered his doubled money. But before he could leave, Miguel leaned forward, his eyes glinting. Double or nothing. James hesitated. The logical thing was to walk away. But if he won again, he could pay half the debt in one night. He swallowed hard. One more roll. The dice rolled. And this time, the cheers turned into silence. Miguel grinned. James had lost everything. A sinking feeling took over his body. All his hard-earned money, gone. Miguel laughed, clapping him on the shoulder. That's why farm boys shouldn't play with wolves. James clenched his fists, his jaw tight with anger and regret. As he walked away, the weight of failure crushed him. One day was gone. Two remained. But despite the setback, he wasn't giving up. Because Carolina was still waiting for him. And he wouldn't let her down. James walked through the quiet village streets, his body exhausted but his mind racing. The weight of his failure pressed down on him, but he couldn't afford to let it crush him. He still had 2 days left. He still had a chance. He made his way to Carolina's home, hoping to see her before the night ended. As he neared the door, he saw her standing beneath the large oak tree in the yard, her arms wrapped around herself as if shielding herself from the cold. "Carolina," James whispered, stepping forward. She turned, her eyes filled with unshed tears. "James, please tell me you have good news." His silence was enough of an answer. Her shoulders sagged, and she looked away. "Then it's over. My fate is sealed." "No," James said quickly, stepping closer. "I won't let this happen. There has to be another way." Carolina gave him a sad smile. "James, we are not just fighting against debt. We are fighting against power. Mr. Rodriguez doesn't just want to be repaid. He wants to own me." The thought of it made James' blood boil. "Then we fight him. We expose him for the monster he is." Carolina shook her head. "And what will that change? He has money connections. He could destroy my family if he wanted to." James clenched his fists. Every time he found hope, it felt like the world was pulling it away. "Carolina," he said softly, reaching for her hand. "Do you love me?" Tears slipped down her cheeks as she nodded. "With all my heart." James swallowed hard, his resolve hardening. "Then trust me. I won't let him take you. I will find a way." A sudden rustling in the bushes made them both turn. Mr. Rodriguez stepped out of the shadows, his expression smug. "How sweet," he sneered. "The poor farm boy making promises he can't keep." James' body tensed as Mr. Rodriguez took slow, deliberate steps toward them. "Let me explain something to you, boy," Rodriguez said, his voice dripping with arrogance. "You don't matter. Your love doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is that Carolina belongs to me now." Carolina flinched at his words, but James stepped protectively in front of her. "She is not yours," he growled. Rodriguez chuckled. "And what will you do? Fight me? Take me to court? The law is on my side, James. The whole village knows it." James felt his chest tighten with anger, but before he could respond, Rodriguez turned to Carolina. "You will be my wife, and there's nothing this boy can do to stop it." He reached out to grab her wrist, but Carolina yanked her hand away, her voice strong and unwavering. "No. I will never be yours." Rodriguez's eyes darkened. "You don't have a choice." James stepped forward, his fists clenched. "She does. And if you think the entire village will stand by and let you do this, you're wrong." Rodriguez smirked. "Who will stop me? A bunch of farmers." A voice rang out behind them. "Yes." James turned and saw Mr. Alvarez, the blacksmith, standing with a group of villagers. Then another voice. "And us." More villagers emerged from their homes, men, women, even the elderly, standing together, their faces set with determination. Carolina's parents stepped forward. "We were wrong," her father admitted, his voice shaking. "Our daughter is not a debt to be paid. She is our child." Rodriguez's smug expression faltered. He looked around, realizing that for the first time, he was outnumbered. "This isn't over," he spat, his face red with fury. "You'll all regret this." He turned on his heel and stormed away. James turned to Carolina, breathless. "It's over," he whispered. Carolina looked around at the people who had stood up for her, then back at James. "No, James," she said with a soft smile. "It's just the beginning." And as she stepped into his arms, the whole village cheered. A new day had come, a day that Carolina never thought she'd see. She stood outside her home, feeling the crisp morning breeze against her skin. She was free. No more forced marriage. No more being treated like a debt to be paid. She turned to see James approaching, his shirt still stained with the sweat of hard labor. Yet to her, he looked stronger than ever, not because of his muscles, but because of his heart. "Good morning, James," she said softly. He smiled, relief written all over his face. "Good morning, Carolina. How do you feel?" She took a deep breath, then exhaled. "Like I can finally breathe again." James chuckled, stepping closer. "So what happens now?" Carolina's eyes drifted toward the fields, where her father and mother stood, watching her with guilt and love in their eyes. They had almost sold her future away, but in the end, they had stood up for her. She took James's hand. "We rebuild." Over the next few days, the entire village rallied behind Carolina's family. Mr. Rodriguez had left in a fury, but not before threatening to take their land and leave them with nothing. But the villagers had a plan. The blacksmith, Mr. Alvarez, helped repair their tools and wagons. The farmers, led by James, worked on the land, planting new crops. The shopkeepers, who had once feared Rodriguez's influence, started donating food and supplies. The power of love and unity filled the air. And slowly, Carolina's family began to stand on their own feet again. One evening, Carolina sat beside James under the oak tree, the same place where she had once thought her life was over. "You saved me, James," she whispered. James shook his head. "No. You saved yourself. I just refused to let you fight alone." Tears welled in her eyes as she squeezed his hand. "I love you." James smiled. "I've loved you since we were children, Carolina. And I always will." She leaned in, and under the stars, they shared their first true kiss, one filled with love, freedom, and hope. With Rodriguez gone, his grip on the people had vanished. The town flourished, the land thrived, and Carolina's family had rebuilt their lives, this time on their own terms. And at the center of it all was Carolina and James. On a beautiful spring afternoon, the village gathered again, but this time for a wedding. Carolina stood in a simple but elegant white dress, surrounded by the people who had once fought for her. Her father, once broken with regret, now stood tall with pride as he walked her down the aisle. At the altar, James waited for her, his eyes shining with love. As she reached him, he took her hands, his grip strong and steady. "Are you ready?" he whispered. Carolina smiled. "I've never been more ready." And as they exchanged vows, sealing their love in front of the people who mattered most, Carolina knew one thing for certain. Love was not a debt to be paid. It was a gift to be cherished. And she would cherish James forever.